An elderly woman muttered a hateful remark at a black man in a grocery store, but his calm, powerful response left the entire crowd speechless. What happened next was a lesson in dignity and courage that no one saw coming. It was a typical Saturday afternoon at Brookside Market, the Charleston, South Carolina. Marcus Hayes, a tall black man in his early 30s, waited in line with a quiet ease. His basket held only a few essentials: bread, fruit, and milk. As he made small talk with the cashier, their laughter blended into the store's familiar hum. Then, the air changed. Behind him, an older woman with a tightly clenched purse stiffened, her expression sharpening. She glanced at Marcus, her lips pressing into a thin line, and then, in a voice just loud enough to slice through the noise, she muttered, "Why don't you go back to Africa?" The store fell silent. The cashier froze, mid-scan. Conversations halted. People turned, eyes darting between the woman and Marcus. The weight of her words hung in the air, ugly, undeniable. A father pulled his son closer. A young man near the magazine rack gripped his phone, already recording. But Marcus didn't react, not yet. Instead, he turned, slow, deliberate, his face unreadable. He met the woman's glare with something far more unsettling than anger: calm. And that's when the real story began. The grocery store had never been this quiet. Marcus Hayes stood still, his face unreadable, as the weight of the older woman's words lingered in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. The hum of conversation, the rhythmic beeping of cash registers, everything had stopped. The woman's eyes locked onto his, her expression defiant, as if daring him to react. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her shopping cart, her knuckles white. He could feel the eyes on him. The cashier, a young woman no older than 20, looked horrified. A father in line further back instinctively pulled his son closer. A young man near the magazine rack clutched his phone, already recording. Marcus inhaled slowly. Then he turned. Not in anger, not in aggression, but with a calm so controlled, so deliberate, it was unsettling. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough weight to force everyone to listen. The woman scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. "You heard me," she shot back. "People like you don't belong here." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. A man in a baseball cap whispered something to his wife, who shook her head. The cashier's hand trembled slightly as she tried to keep scanning items, her gaze darting between Marcus and the woman. Marcus took a step forward, not enough to be confrontational, but just enough to close the distance. He was taller than her, broader, but his presence wasn't about intimidation. It was something else, an unshakable, quiet power. "Do you know where I'm from?" he asked, his voice even, his eyes locked onto hers. The woman's mouth curled into a smirk. "What does it matter?" "It matters," Marcus said, pausing just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Because my family has been in this town for 5 generations. My great-grandfather was a bricklayer. He built half the houses in this neighborhood, maybe even yours. My grandmother, she was a nurse, working double shifts at St. Luke's, when this town had 1 hospital for black families and 3 for white." A few people in the crowd shifted, their discomfort growing. "My father?" Marcus continued. "He fought for this country in Vietnam, came home and wasn't allowed to eat in the same diners as the men he fought beside. And me?" He glanced around, making eye contact with the onlookers. "I've lived here all my life. Went to Jefferson High, played football, went to college on a scholarship, came back here, and started my own business." His voice dropped lower, steadier. "So I'll ask you again. Where are you from?" The woman's smug expression faltered. For the first time since she spoke, she looked unsure. The weight of the question sat heavy in the air. Marcus didn't blink. He didn't move. Neither did anyone else. A long silence stretched between them. Thick, suffocating, inescapable. The woman swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. She had no answer. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. The applause rippled through the store, not thunderous, but steady and deliberate. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about all the people who had stood in his shoes before, who had heard the same words, felt the same weight, and stayed silent because they thought no one would stand with them. The woman's face flushed deep red. Her hands, which had been gripping the cart like an anchor, finally loosened. She glanced around at the people clapping, the cashier, the older man near the produce, the mother with a child gripping her leg. Her breathing became uneven, as if the reality of what had just happened was finally sinking in. Marcus let the applause fade before he spoke again. "I don't hate you," he said, his voice softer now but no less firm. "I don't even know you. And that's the point. You don't know me either. But you decided, before I even opened my mouth, that I didn't belong. You let that decision shape your words, your actions." The woman swallowed, the weight of shame settling into her bones. Marcus took a breath. "You can keep carrying that hate if you want to. You can walk out of here, pretend this moment never happened, but you and I both know something changed today." The woman exhaled shakily. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then finally spoke. She stopped, shaking her head as if she couldn't quite find the words. Marcus didn't move, didn't press her to say more. Instead, he waited, because sometimes the silence is where the real change happens. The grocery store felt different now, lighter somehow. The air had shifted. Conversations had started. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap near the frozen food aisle turned to his wife. "He handled that better than I ever could have," he murmured. His wife nodded, watching Marcus with something close to admiration. The cashier, still gripping the conveyor belt as if steadying herself, sniffed and wiped a tear from her cheek. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saying what needed to be said." Marcus gave her a small nod, then turned back to the woman. She finally met his gaze. "I was wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Marcus offered a faint, knowing smile. "I know," he said, and with that, the moment ended. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with something closer to hope. The store manager, a middle-aged man with a pressed blue uniform and tired eyes, finally stepped forward. He cleared his throat, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "Sir," he said to Marcus, his voice cautious, "on behalf of the store, I want to apologize for what happened here today. That kind of language, that kind of behavior." He glanced at the woman, whose gaze remained fixed on the floor. "It's not something we tolerate." Marcus studied the manager for a moment, then extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, shaking the man's hand firmly. "But it's not just about words. It's about how we treat people when no one's watching." The manager swallowed hard, nodding. "We're gonna do better," he said. "I mean that." The woman remained frozen in place, her fingers white-knuckling the edge of her cart. The world had turned on its head in the span of just a few minutes. The anger, the confidence she once had been stripped away, replaced with something raw and unfamiliar. Regret. Shame. She took a shaky breath, glancing at Marcus again. And for the first time, she really looked at him. Not as an idea, not as an assumption, but as a person. She hesitated. "I didn't mean—" Marcus exhaled softly. He'd heard those words before, 100 different ways. "Yes, you did," he said. "And that's why it matters." Her lips pressed together. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back something she didn't want anyone to see. The cashier, still standing at the register, nodded slowly, her hands fidgeting with the receipt roll. "I think a lot of us learned something today," she murmured. A small voice suddenly cut through the quiet. "Mister?" Everyone turned. A boy, no older than 10, with a messy cowlick and a half-melted candy bar in his hand, stepped forward. He was looking up at Marcus with wide, serious eyes. "What you said," the boy hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "That was really brave." Marcus knelt slightly, meeting the boy's gaze with a warm, steady look. "Kindness," he said, "is the bravest thing anyone can do." The boy's grip on his candy tightened. He nodded once, then stepped back into his mother's arms, his expression thoughtful. The woman, the same one who had started this whole thing, watched the boy, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. And for the first time that day, she looked small. Not because she had been humiliated, but because in that moment, she realized she had been wrong. Marcus gave her one last look before grabbing his bags. Some lessons don't need to be spoken aloud, some are felt. And today the entire store had felt it. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air as Marcus turned toward the exit, his grip tightening around his grocery bags. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the ripple effect of what had just transpired wasn't fading. It was settling into people's bones. The young cashier exhaled shakily, her hands still trembling slightly as she tried to scan the next customer's items. The store manager stood near the front, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He knew that something had shifted in his store today, something he had let fester for far too long. But it was the older woman who remained completely still. Her fingers hovered over the handle of her cart, her eyes flicking from Marcus to the people still watching her. She wasn't just humiliated, she was exposed. For the first time, she saw the faces around her not as background noise in her own world, but as individuals, people who had witnessed the worst of her, and still somehow given her something unexpected, a chance. Marcus paused at the door as if he could feel her hesitation. He turned, locking eyes with her one last time. And then, she did something no one expected. She took a step forward. "Wait!" she called after him, her voice softer now, missing the venom it carried earlier. Marcus stopped, his expression unreadable. The store went quiet again. She hesitated, her throat bobbing as she tried to find the words. No one bailed her out, no one excused her. This moment was hers alone to face. She started, but her voice cracked. Her fingers curled into fists as she exhaled. "I was wrong." A murmur rippled through the store. The cashier froze, her eyes widening. The manager tilted his head slightly as if he wasn't sure he had heard her correctly. But Marcus? Marcus just watched. She took another breath, blinking rapidly as if ashamed of the way her voice shook. "I don't have an excuse," she admitted, "and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I see it now." Marcus let the silence stretch for a moment before he finally spoke. "See what?" he asked, not unkindly but with a quiet firmness that demanded honesty. The woman swallowed hard. "I see." She struggled, her shoulders sinking. "I see that people like me never stop to think about what people like you have lived through." Another silence. This one felt different, real, honest. Marcus studied her, then slowly nodded. "That's a start," he said. The woman exhaled, something raw and unfamiliar flickering in her expression. She nodded once, then turned back to her cart, not saying another word. No one clapped, no one cheered. But everyone in that store walked away a little different than they had been before. Marcus left the store that day thinking the moment had passed, that it was just another painful but necessary encounter in a lifetime of navigating spaces where he was often seen as other. But what he didn't realize was that the moment wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had been there that day. The cashier, Emily, couldn't shake the lump in her throat as she continued scanning groceries. The words Marcus had spoken, the history, the calm dignity, the truth, lingered like an echo in her mind. That night, she sat at her kitchen table scrolling through news articles about Black history in America. She realized how little she truly knew. The store manager, Dave, found himself pacing in his office later that evening, staring at the surveillance footage of the incident. How had he let this happen in his store? Worse, how many times had he seen something similar and brushed it off as just another bad interaction? And the older woman, Margaret, went home in silence, dropping her grocery bags onto the counter and staring at her own reflection in the kitchen window. For the first time in her 68 years, she felt small, not in the way she had feared, not in the way she had always tried to fight against, but in a way that made her realize she had been blind to so much. The next morning, Marcus's phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something told him to pick up. "Hello?" A deep breath on the other end, then a familiar voice. "Mr. Carter?" It was Dave, the store manager. Marcus straightened in his chair. "Yes?" Dave hesitated. "I just wanted to say I saw what happened yesterday and I should have stepped in sooner. I should have said something. That's on me." Marcus wasn't expecting that. "People like me," Dave continued. We always think it's not our place to step in. But yesterday I realized something. Silence is just another kind of choice, and I don't want to make that choice anymore. Marcus nodded slowly. Acknowledging it is the first step, he said. Dave exhaled. I don't just want to acknowledge it, I want to fix it. He cleared his throat. We're starting mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, not some corporate checklist nonsense, real training. And I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to come in and share your experience. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he hadn't expected his words to take root so quickly. Yeah, he finally said. Yeah, I'd be honored to. And just like that, what started as a painful moment of confrontation turned into the first step towards something bigger than anyone had imagined. Marcus hadn't thought much about the conversation with Dave after he hung up. People made promises all the time. Some followed through, most didn't. He'd learned not to expect much. But just 3 days later, he got another call. This time from Emily, the young cashier. Hey, Mr. Carter, she said hesitantly. I hope this isn't weird, but I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day. It stuck with me, and I wanted to do something about it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Okay. Emily took a deep breath. I go to community college, and I work on the student paper. After what happened, I wrote about it. Not just about what she said, but about your response. About how it made people think. She hesitated. I think it's important for people to hear. Marcus leaned back in his chair. You wrote about it? Yeah. She paused. And the editor published it this morning. Marcus sat up straighter. Wait, what? It's online, Emily continued. And it's blowing up. People are sharing it like crazy. Marcus pulled out his laptop and typed his name into the search bar. Sure enough, the article was everywhere. The headline stopped him cold. One man's words, stopped a grocery store cold. Here's why they matter. The article described everything, not just the moment in the store, but the way the air had shifted, the way people had been forced to look at themselves. Emily had captured the weight of the moment in a way Marcus hadn't expected, and the response? Overwhelming. The comments poured in. This gave me chills. We need more people like him in this world. I've stayed quiet in situations like this before, never again. I'm sharing this with my kids. This is how you stand up for yourself with dignity. Marcus sat there for a long time, scrolling through the words of strangers, feeling something he couldn't quite describe. Then another text popped up. Unknown number. Mr. Carter, I read about what happened. Would love to chat. CNN. His heart stopped. Marcus had only wanted to do his grocery shopping that day. He hadn't asked to be in the spotlight, but maybe this wasn't about him anymore. Maybe it was about something bigger. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to speak. As Marcus turned to leave, the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in the afternoon sun. But before he could step outside, a small voice called after him. Mister? He turned to see a young boy, no older than 10, clutching a candy bar in one hand. His mother stood behind him, her eyes filled with something between admiration and gratitude. That was brave, the boy said hesitantly. Marcus crouched down to his level, offering a warm smile. Kindness is the bravest thing you can do, he said. Always remember that. The boy nodded, gripping his candy bar a little tighter, as if holding on to those words. Behind them, the older woman stood motionless by her cart. Her fingers trembled on the handle, her once defiant expression now softened into something else, reflection, maybe even regret. She knew without a doubt that she'd carry this moment with her for the rest of her life. The store returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy had shifted. The memory of what had happened here wouldn't fade, not for the customers, not for the employees, and certainly not for her. In 2025, as society grapples with deep divisions, this story serves as a powerful reminder that change starts in the smallest moments. A conversation, a confrontation, a choice. It teaches us that dignity and courage can disarm hate more effectively than anger ever could. In an era of social media outrage and quick judgments, We must choose understanding over division, education over ignorance. This moment in the grocery store wasn't just about one man and one woman. It was about all of us. If we truly want a better future, we must be willing to face hate with grace, truth, and unshakable resolve. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a defining moment. What should happen next? Should the man take his message further, speaking in schools and communities to inspire change? Should the store implement diversity training to prevent future incidents? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in standing up to ignorance with courage and dignity, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for more powerful moments like this. Every comment, every share, and every voice matters. Let's keep the conversation going and be the change the world needs.